So, no pressure after that wonderful speech there from Gary Hamel. I hope you're all ready to up the ante here. This is the industry leaders debate. So obviously we're going to be talking about how industry leaders can respond to the kind of fast-paced change that we're seeing around the world. We have obviously members of the academia. We also have members of that technology world itself and entrepreneurs as well who are creating ideas too. First of all, let me come to you first, Tom. What we heard there about management, it's interesting because you're in the role of you're a director at IDEO, but you're also a founder of OpenIDEO. So how do you manage to implement what Professor Gary was just saying there before about thinking big, but managing as though it's small? Which one's right?
So I agree with most of what was said. The interesting thing for me is businesses have gone through periods of sort of exploration of new ideas and then exploitation of those ideas, and that gap is shortening. Now they need to happen in parallel. So I see my job as blending actually both sides of the equation, a bit of management 1.0 with a bit of management 2.0.
How do you do that?
And so ways I do it, the good news is it's not completely binary. There are small things you can do. I think there's a lot in the previous talk around experimentation. That's the good news. You don't have to leap all in. So, you know, whenever you hear a debate about should my business be completely open or completely closed, that shouldn't be the decision that you have to make. You can think about what's partially open. There's always a way to open a little bit of the business. There's always an API for management where you can open up something, whether it be a hackathon or something else, to experimentation. So I try, I'm not sure very successfully, but I try to understand which mode different bits of the business are in. Is it a mode where we're looking to be efficient and scale something when we have a product market fit, or are we trying to efficiently explore new ideas and just change the hat accordingly? But it does feel quite schizophrenic sometimes.
Now we're here to talk about how the pressures of disruptive technology and innovation change leadership and also change the vision for companies. Let me come to you, Rashik Parmar. When it comes to a big company like yours, as we were saying before, having the flexibility to take a corner pretty quickly is quite difficult, isn't it?
Sometimes not. So, I mean, you look at what's happening with what we're doing with Watson as an example. Watson as a technology is very disruptive on our existing business, very disruptive in the marketplace. You know, the fact that you can read millions of documents and the computer can actually understand them is going to be revolutionary. We understand that. And what we have to do is create space for the division to merge. And that's why we've created a new division, and Mike Roden owns that division, and we've given him space to go and figure out how to go to market. So sometimes you've got to peel parts of yourself off, let that flourish, and then bring it back in the future. We did that with the PC division. We've done that many times. So
corporate venturing is important as well for navigating these kind of issues as well. Luke Mansfield, Samsung. Well, you're obviously with Samsung Electronics here in Europe, but it is such a massive company. It has been so disruptive to the way how people use everything. I personally have a Samsung. This is an Apple, use the BlackBerry, use a bit of everything. How does a company like Samsung manage to navigate exactly what the customer wants when it's changing, or is it up to you to disrupt the market? Is it a combination of both?
It's a blend of both. So with Samsung, really innovation is the constant within the business. And I think in a fairly unique way, we understand that tomorrow's profits will not come from today's products. So the products we created today, we sell today, are products we created in the past, and the profits of tomorrow will come from the products we're creating today. And so I think, especially in the technology sector, you have to be prepared to enter a new market and let an old market go. And the way Samsung manages that at a corporate level is to just have lots of horses in the race at any given time and allow a fair competition between the two, and not protect an existing technology or an existing position at the expense of a future one.
As we just heard there from Professor Gary Hamel before, you have to take risks, but the problem is the way how big entities emerge are managed these days is that there's no incentivization people take risks because they can lose their job, right?
I think you need to manage risks rather than take risks. So part of the role of my team is to look at new things and to basically understand where the risk is and be able to quantify that. So all senior executives are very good at taking risks if they have appropriate information. And so a big part of our role is to make sure that all our executives have the right information to make the right decisions. And my experience is certainly that people aren't adverse to taking risks, but they are adverse to gambling. And there's a very different thing. And also with risk, I think people often imagine this sort of fixed odds approach, but the reality is one win can pay for all of your other bets. And so it's not this kind of casino approach. If you're managing the risk properly, then a success will more than pay for all of your failures.
Professor Markides, what is the right strategy to have these days for a company? Obviously, it's quite difficult with different companies here on the panel, but...
I don't think I have the answer to that question, but I think if there's one thing I can add to this debate is I find that lack of clarity is one of the biggest problems in organizations. So people talk about disruption as if it's one thing, or they talk about change as if it's one thing, or innovation. And I find that really suffocating. It's like going to the doctor and you say, doctor, I don't feel too well, what should I do? And the doctor immediately prescribes, let's say, aspirin. Well, I'd be very worried if I was the patient, if the doctor prescribes the medicine without first assessing what the real disease is. It's the same with innovation. You know, there are different types of innovation. There are different degrees of innovation. So before I can tell you what you need to do to be innovative, yeah, you have to tell me what innovation you want. Before I can tell you how to respond to a disruption, I need to understand what the disruption is.
But there's one interesting factor that has come up time and time again recently. It's that these large technology companies have huge amounts of cash on the books. I think it's something like $159 billion for Apple. And they don't innovate, they just buy other companies that innovate. Are we getting a bit lazy here on the innovation front when it comes to the big business model for the big names?
Buying intelligently is a form of innovation. So I don't think I will necessarily criticize people. In fact, you know, there is a lot of evidence which show that for some radical disruptive innovations, it's not the big firm that discovers them, it's usually small startup firms, but it's not the small startup firms that scale them up, it's the big firm. So let's have some specialization here. You know, innovation is not one thing. Innovation is discovering and scaling up. Let the small startup firms discover and let the big firm go out and scale it up. Nothing wrong with that.
Look, some big companies, like for instance Google, have had huge success with bringing in small companies, having their own incubators. Even if they don't own a huge amount of those companies, they can sort of steer things and keep an eye on what the new technologies are. Is that also something that Samsung would do? Is it a big issue?
Well, I agree with Costas, which is that if you try and define innovation rigorously, you very quickly will spend all of your time sort of pontificating about it and no time actually doing it. And the reality is innovation is the creation of new value. It's that simple. And so anything that can do that, I think, is a perfectly legitimate strategy for innovation. And so, you know, of course we work with small companies and we're talent spotting for small organizations and bringing some of those in-house, incubating some out of house. I counted the other day, within Samsung, there are 28 different innovation groups. And I think that's a really, really good thing.
How does that fit with the bureaucracy of the organization then? Because Samsung is known for being bureaucratic a bit.
Well, I think bureaucratic's one way of looking at it. I think organized and disciplined is another way of looking at it. And I think that discipline is a core component of the success of the organization.
Very diplomatically put. Do you ever find that you have a tough time integrating some of this young talent, though? Because discipline is not necessarily what the millennials are famous for these days.
I think in terms of integration, you know, all the business literature says the same. You only integrate something fully when you're looking for the resources and not the skills. I think when we are looking for that skill set, we would much prefer to partner with that organization than try and own the organization. And, you know, throughout Samsung's history, we've made a lot of strategic investments. It's actually very rare that we would buy a company and bring it in-house. So it's much more common that we would partner with someone than try and bring them in-house.
And for those of us who know your business model, yes, that is the way it's going to stay, is it?
I think it will stay that way if that's the best way for us moving forward.
Great. Tom, your company is a really interesting one in the sense that you keep an idea on the market, what people want. You help companies create the products people want. You help them actually create those disruptive technologies that none of us knew we needed, but now that we have them, life is great, right? How do you manage to do that?
It's so we've heard about a lot of choices and we're kind of overwhelmed with choices in terms of strategy or acquisition versus organic growth. For us, the organizing principle is we should optimize for the customer. So even in a business environment, you should start with the customer. It was mentioned earlier, Amazon's approach of working backwards. Before they start a project or they write a line of code, they try and articulate what the customer benefit is. And we would always start there. And actually, I think acquisition is a very rational approach if it's the most efficient way to deliver delight to your customer. So our approach is customer-centered. We will start by understanding the customer. Where is the market moving over time? You know, are the extremes of today really the norms of tomorrow? In which case, maybe we should be designing for them. And then what's the most efficient way we can test our hypothesis and have it evolve in the marketplace? And so sometimes our recommendations are a completely novel product or service, or sometimes if the product is already out there, it's an acquisition.
It's interesting when you look at, we were having this discussion offline before, about companies like Apple. We think of Steve Jobs as the great innovator, but the reality is that there was a lot of people behind him, people working with him, other companies, perhaps even like yours, that work with these big tech titans. But what is it about a figurehead that seems to make it cool and saleable?
I don't want to put the responsibility on you, but I think it's partly because it's great for journalists to tell stories. I think we like
That's true.
I think we like to focus on an individual. I think having a charismatic leader who can ultimately make the call is absolutely correct. I think maybe one of the things that's interesting about Apple, they very publicly don't do focus groups, which I think is a good thing, because usually what you learn in focus groups is at best wrong. At worst, it's deliberately misleading because people don't want to be honest. And people say, oh, Apple don't care about the customer. What Apple did is a different approach, which is they staffed the company with their potential customers. These guys, like great entrepreneurs, are scratching their own itches. They're designing products for themselves. And Apple did a phenomenal job of that. And I think probably Steve Jobs' greatest legacy is he staffed the company with people that would be scratching their own itches and were unafraid to say no. Historically, it was him that was making that very binary decision. But subsequently, actually, there's very capable guys there like Johnny Ive who are saying no all the time. And that's probably one of the biggest responsibilities of managers, is to say no.
So if you're in a luxurious position like Apple and you have the cool factor, use your own human resources as a target audience to try things out on, but also to gain ideas and just to make your brand cool.
And have the humility to realize that maybe that iconic figurehead isn't the best for all generations and all the market, and maybe acquire a company like Beats that might be. So a lot of management thinkers were saying, why the hell would they buy Beats? If you were to ask teenagers, they would tell you very clearly which was a cooler brand.
Rashik, how is the innovation cycle going? It's obviously going very fast, but where is it going?
So I think innovation really comes from two perspectives. One perspective is ideas. And it's people like Tom was just mentioning there that got smart ideas for things that they care about. And those ideas will transform people's lives. It'll make it easier for us to travel around, make it easier for us to get the right food, all that kind of stuff. The other side of innovation is challenge-led, where executives start to see there's opportunities to do things differently, things better. And the challenges that they force on the company itself, the structure, helps drive that innovation. So the team that I lead in the academy is actually one of those that bridges both those gaps. So we represent 1,000 or so of our technical community, and we get ideas from the community at large and partners and academic partners and clients and so on. Those ideas get filtered into big things that could make a difference.
How many of them, roughly? How much is watered out?
So we would net down something like, we start with over 4,000 ideas at the beginning of the year. We net it down to a dozen or so that we're going to actually focus on, because you've got to have enough time to focus on them. And they then become the things that we will challenge corporate strategy. The corporate strategy will come with their views of where they want to take the company, and the community will challenge them with their view. And through the challenge, will come with something that makes sense. And so you might say, well, give us an example. And the best example is actually the Smarter Planet initiative we launched back in 2008. The community came forward and said innovation in the form of instrumentation will allow us to get vast amounts of information from the world that we live in. We'll be able to censor almost anything. Through that censoring and bringing together our own models and understanding of the world, we'll be able to make smarter decisions, and we'll be able to address some of the societal issues. And so we can make a smarter planet. And so we can start to solve some of the societal issues, et cetera, so that technical underpinning of the ideas of thousands of technical leaders across the company netted into that messaging meant that Sam, when he was standing up and presenting in the House of Congress and so on, he had the confidence that this was the right way forward. So although he hadn't challenges, the idea were coming through. From a challenge perspective, the challenge that we were given 4 years ago to go and build a computer system that could go and beat the world champions at Jeopardy resulted in a computer that can read large amounts of documentation. So those are two examples of where ideas can create new insight and innovation, and challenges can create innovation.
But you have to have the right ecological system inside a company to make the use of that. Professor Markides, disruptive technology sometimes, for many of us, feels a bit like the blind leading the blind, going out into the dark and feeling your way around, and it changes by the day. We now have the Internet of Things that should be around soon, more people than ever before connected to the Internet, and they all expect something different. Where is it going? Where are the opportunities and also the challenges?
Yeah. Where is it going? Well, nobody really knows, and I think that's what Gary Hammer was talking about, the need to create flexible organizations that whatever the future unfolds to be, we are ready and able to take advantage of it. I don't think, if you ask me to make a prediction about where is it going, I can't really say where is it going.
But if companies had to decide where to put their eggs in one basket versus another basket, so we've identified perhaps that the strategy is to have your own little ventures and incubators inside companies, but is enough being invested in innovation? I mean, this is fine, we're talking with technology companies here, but just generally in the broader economy as well.
Yeah. I know many companies, especially in Silicon Valley, big companies that invest, they would have equity ventures with small startup firms. A company like Google, for example, will have more than 3,000 equity ventures with little startup firms, keeping an eye on the technologies that are being developed, and when the time comes, moving in and buying the technology and integrating into the organization. You cannot predict the future, you see. You could do something to, prepare for it. But, the worst that could happen is that you go bankrupt, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I think that's the whole process of capitalism. You grow old, you die, and the resources are moved on to new startup firms. I mean, you don't want your mother and your father to live forever, do you? They're going to die. They will die, and that's good for society because you give opportunity for younger generation to move up. The same with companies. You try to innovate. If you fail, you fail. Move on, and the resources are allocated somewhere else.
Where are you allocating the resources then?
So at the moment, we're allocating a lot of resources. It's interesting, the debate about consumer research, because I think focus groups are very useful for certain things, as long as you use them as a sensible tool, like all types of research. And I agree with the jobs quote that it's not the consumer's job to know what they want, but I can tell you from experience that consumers know absolutely what they don't want. And so when we're developing new things, I mean, we've spent a total of 5 years in consumers' homes in the last 3 years, my team. Living with consumers, going out in their cars with them, going to work, just hanging out and observing and understanding what are people's lives like. And the problem with staffing your company with your customers is that basically you get products for hipsters. And a lot of people within companies don't really understand the realities of a working mum in Bradford. And those are our customers, And so it's important to have a very democratic view of innovation. It does come from outside, and it comes from a deep understanding of the lives of the people who buy your product, who are often nothing like you at all.
How much of that is brand and how much of that is necessity, if you know what I mean? Being more inclusive as a company, having a brand that is perceived as more accessible by everybody.
I think Samsung's always perceived itself as a very democratic brand. So we're a brand that creates products at every price point. So we make very premium products and we make very basic products for people. And so to do both of those things well, you need to understand a very broad spectrum of our customers. We need to understand what they need, and in some cases what they don't need, and take stuff away.
Well, what have you found that they need then? Because that's changing again every day.
Well, I mean, I think a great example of that is, so I use the Galaxy S5 as an example. So one of the things that I can tell you about parents all over Europe is anyone with kids between 2 and 7, when you go into their homes, they have a drawer, usually in the kitchen, which is their graveyard for phones. Yeah. Smartphones, tablets get smashed and they go in the drawer where they get left forever. And that's why the Galaxy S4 Active initially and the Galaxy S5 are now much more robust. They're waterproof. And they're basically designed not for people who go abseiling and base jumping. They're designed for people who have small kids that break their stuff.
So how long, sorry, I'm just trying to nail down the process of understanding how you came to the decision, because even on CNN we've done pieces about how people are going back to the mobile, brick-like mobile phone that's unhackable, indestructible, et cetera, et cetera. How long does it take you to do your market research to identify that that's a trend you need to put your money on?
So typically we would take between 6 to 18 months to go from research through to product, depending on how complex the technology is. Whether we have, so we have 65,000 people developing new technology around the world. And so often we have the technologies we need waiting, and we can deploy those. And sometimes we need to develop new things. Other times we need to work with partners. And so we'll do whatever we need to do. Once we have an insight and we have a product that we want to bring to market, we will then do whatever we need to do to make that happen.
Let me open up the floor to questions now to see whether anybody has any questions to jump in. Make sure you all get the chance to say something. Do you have any questions? I'm afraid, apologies, I can't see very well from over here. Nope, not yet. Please tweet me if you do have any questions. Luke, sorry to be the attack dog. I want to ask you another question, though. And this is one that comes up time and time again with upgradable technology like yours. We have great disruptive products out there, but the networks sometimes aren't able to cable into them and provide the full comprehensive service to use your products in the way they should be. This comes up time and time again. How do you manage to find out, to get your business cycle to work in tandem with the other parts of the industry that you need? Like telecommunications providers, for instance.
Yeah, so we work very closely with our network partners, and we work very closely with lots of service partners. The most important thing is don't rely too heavily on other people. Make sure the experience works in and of itself with the technology that's available today. Sure, you build for the technology of tomorrow, but you have to plan for it not being ready or not being there. And you just have to build that into the concept and build that into the product. And if it's not ready by the time the product goes to market, well, let's make sure that the product's amazing without it anyway. And so it's really about sort of building for the future, but actually, really the core experience needs to be using what's available today.
Tom, this must come up time and time again when you're having your idea labs to find out what the latest big product is, and whether it's a Samsung Curve TV that you can upgrade. If you can't cable it into your internet provider and get fiber optic, what's the point?
So there's interesting thinking around when systems should be interdependent and when they should be standalone. So I'm sure that Luke's company does a phenomenal job that if they have full confidence in one idea and they have to build the full stack, they will do it. They only rely on external technologies when that's more efficient than doing it in-house. So I think it's very rational. One of the interesting things that I think large companies often struggle with is the value of options. For me, that's a really big difference in what we're talking about often. So Luke's analysis, I think, is really smart because he sees the value of an option even if it's not guaranteed today. Entrepreneurs naturally do that. Like, I work with entrepreneurs who will understand just innately that there is value in data without putting it on the balance sheet. They know there's value therein, and they know, even though they can't define how it might be used today, it might be a source of competitive advantage in the future. So I think the best large companies and most entrepreneurs actually compete through optionality, which in the world that Gary described is becoming more important. In a more volatile world, you can't dictate the future, so you want to invest in as many options as you can, and primarily those where you have some sort of unfair advantage if they happen.
Rashik, I see you're agreeing with this.
Yeah, you've got to create a platform, and the platform gives you your base of the options. So when you look at any technology segment, whether it's a Samsung phone, whether it's a service on the cloud, you're creating a platform on which you will add features and grow from that. And so once you've got that initial customer experience, you've got to continually delight the customer, because once you've had that experience, it's commodity, right?
Exactly.
Right? And that commoditization happens faster and faster now. So you've got to constantly think about how I'm going to add to that experience and constantly make it fresh and interesting and relevant.
So what do you have to add to it these days? Because also, as you said, the cloud enables you to be able to add a whole plethora of things that you could have done before. Yeah,
so you've got, all of a sudden, it's no longer just that I've got a handset here. It's the fact that through that handset, I can access a world of services, right? And even today, I come out of the underground, at where it was Shepherd's Bush corner, where the hotel was. How do I get from there to the hotel? It takes too long for me to do that, right? And that'd be fantastic if I could instantly get some services, even traveling around in different parts of the world. Travel is still constantly a challenge. I mean, you probably find that as well. Yeah, how much do we actually get? There's still so much to be done to improve the information service to make our lives easier to live.
Professor Markides, there's certainly opportunities here from the disruptive world, but one of the challenges one assumes further down the line will come up is that people just, we take very basic services for granted, if you like, the average things in life, because they're not technologically cool, they don't make our lives that much easier in comparison to having your smartphone. Maps are obsolete. Are we going to pay the consequences of that later on, do you think?
I think there's wonderful opportunities for us, many, many positives, but there are many risks and downsides as well. You see it already in how the younger generation behaves. Some of us can point to many, many positive things, and there are many negatives as well.
What do you mean, then, the younger generation behaves? So you're talking about millennials entering the workforce?
Yeah, for example, we know that there's a lot of research which shows that exposure to the internet physically rewires the human brain and makes us less attentive. The attention span of the human beings now is down to seconds, where it's been estimated to be 28 seconds, which basically means the audience lost us about an hour ago. And I think you heard before my colleague Andrew Scott was talking about how when he was growing up, he loved the idea of taking a book and sitting down and being immersed in the book and being lost in his thoughts and so on. Whereas the younger generation now, it's like 20 seconds, 30 seconds, they want to move on to something else. They're not good listeners, they're not attentive and so on. I think most of us would say that's a negative of this technology. And there's certainly other negatives that you will see.
Do you think that socially we will pay the price, even if economically we will do quite well out of the disruptive revolution we're seeing?
I think every generation goes through challenges, and every generation finds ways to overcome those challenges. Yes, we're going to have social challenges as a result of all these technologies, but I'm an optimist. I think we will find a way of overcoming them.
Let me see whether we can take a question along these lines. Anybody in the audience? Please don't be shy. Question in the front row with the lady with the white jacket, thanks.
Thank you. Claudia Ruiz-Graham with BP. I just had a question. When in your companies you get so many innovative ideas, you were talking about in the thousands, what systems do you have to screen them out and filter to the ones that really matter?
Let me ask you for Samsung.
So step one is just intuition. So like I say, we spend a lot of time with our customers, and I think on my team, we have a very good sense of the kind of things people might like. And when I say people, I mean people. So, people who live in semi-detached houses in suburbs and, drive average cars. So we have a good sense of that. We have a number of testing methodologies in-house. But the two things that we're always looking for is something that feels a little bit enchanted, something a bit magical. People love that. They love to feel that something's impossible or magical. So that's very important. And secondly, something that just genuinely is actually useful. And if you can combine magic and useful together, then you've got a great product.
How do you deliver the feedback to somebody that their idea is not good then? Because you must get quite a few of them.
Nobody owns an idea. So an idea is not a thing. An idea is a notion, it's a thought. A product concept is a completely thought out technological package with a business model, with costings. Those are the kind of things which you can have a conversation around. It's very difficult to have a conversation around a notion or an idea, and so no one really owns those, and so there's definitely no problem with one of those dying because it's not owned by anyone.
Tom, let me ask you, because obviously ideas is your business, that's what you make your money from. How do you screen out the good and the bad ones? How do you sort the wheat from the chaff, and how much investment do you put in that?
On the IDEO side, one of the things we do is, and I think this will resonate with everyone here, is we prototype very early. So one of the challenges with traditional sort of 5-page Excel spreadsheets around a concept is no one can really understand if they're good for the customer. So we bring it to life as quickly and as efficiently as possible. And technology is actually massively dropping the costs of bringing stuff to life. So I cannot imagine any business today where you wouldn't want to prototype something early out in the wild. it applies to real estate, it applies to everything. And then wearing my other hat around the sort of collaborative software, we look for ideas that actually build an inertia inside the organization. And it's surprising how often bad ideas filter themselves out. People, as long as, Luke's point again is good, it's like as long as you don't make it proprietary and you don't attach it to an individual's self-esteem, and actually the crowd or the community ask them questions, they very quickly realize if it's a good or bad idea themselves. As long as you see an idea as a journey rather than a finished, polished product, then I think they naturally fall by the wayside. So we look for teams coalescing around ideas and ability to kind of challenge one another's assumptions and evolve.
How difficult is it in a big organization like IBM, in so many places around the world, to foster ideas and then also filter them out?
So fostering the ideas, I think we are a big innovation company. We file many patents, so that's not a problem. Selecting the ideas is done by very simple criteria. And it's prototyping and things everybody else said. But we look at the client value. What's the client experience can potentially create through this? What's the doability of this? How technologically advanced or doable is this? And that doability piece is something that we look at quite carefully. And the prototyping stage helps us understand that. And then ultimately, what's the potential value for us? So what's the value of us doing it? Is it something we should put out there?
How democratic is that process then, all the way to the top through a company like IBM?
So we
room
have
for improvement?
Yeah, well, there's always room for improvement, yes. But we have structures, and the way the company works is we have technical executives and business executives. And that constant yin and yang of the two allows the ideas to progress through that. You might argue that's too slow, but actually it happens very quickly. And so right at the grassroots level, you have this yin and yang, and it progresses right the way through the senior executives. So with the Academy, I sit alongside our senior executives and challenge exactly what's going on at the most senior level. So we have that ability to take decisions.
Can I respond to that? I think there are basically three ways to evaluate any idea. You can use analysis, and you can use criteria to do the analysis. You can use intuition, or you can use experimentation and so on. So those are the three basic ways. What's changing, I think, is who does the evaluation. In the past, it was centralized. It was the top people who were supposed to evaluate them. Whereas now you see a more decentralized approach where you can open it up in a very democratic way. You can let other people evaluate the idea and decide whether you should proceed with them.
So as a professional of management, where do you view that going in all these big and small organizations?
Well, I think the technology is allowing us to decentralize things. As Professor Hulme was saying before, you're going to see increasingly more decentralized processes in the organization, this being one. Strategy making, for example, used to be a very centralized process. It doesn't have to be. At least part of the strategy process could be decentralized and let everybody in the organization or outside the organization contribute to the ideas that compose the strategy.
Is that, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here, tacking and jibing in the other direction a good thing, though, for industry, especially when we're talking about huge companies? Don't they need a certain amount of structure anyway to be particularly functional? And shareholders demand that too.
Yes, and in fact, if I could repeat and re-emphasize Tom's original point, which is that, sometimes when you hear people saying you should do this, you should do that, they usually use examples of new startup firms like Google and say, don't you want to be like Google? And it's like asking my 70-year-old father, saying, look, I can train you to win the Olympics next year, and so on. It's not going to happen, It will not going to happen. When you have a company, Samsung out there that's 130 years old or whatever, it has to put in place structures and processes that befit a 130-year-old company. You cannot then show up and say, oh, but then you can be like Google and so on. You can't. You have to have the structure, and within that structure and processes and culture, ask yourself, how much can I deviate? How much decentralization could I have within the structure that I need to operate in?
And what would be your prescription here? Because obviously this feeds right the way through to compensation as well, doesn't it? We're talking about sort of equitization packages. We were talking before where we did the poll online talking about how 39% of people thought that pay shouldn't be regulated at all. And if you look at some of the luxurious valuations for tech companies that are sold with just a few staff, a lot of people assume that it's easy to get rich quick. don't they?
Well, everybody assumes that, but it doesn't mean you have to do it. I mean, let me quote Jack Welch. I remember a long time ago, he said, when people are telling him you have to become like this and like that, he said, the reason people come to work at GE is because they want to work at GE. And by that he meant, they don't want to be revolutionaries. They are accountants and they want to come into a structure and, work 9 to 5 in their business suits and then go home. So, not everybody wants to be decentralized. Not everybody wants to be a revolutionary. Not everybody wants to be, rich overnight and so on. And I think we have to take that into consideration. Different companies have different styles. Not everybody's going to be the same like Google.
Does anybody here in the audience want to wade into this debate about whether we should have still the same structures in management or things should be completely decentralized, especially with big companies? Lessons from entrepreneurs out there? Anybody want to ask a question? We have one here in the second row, thanks.
So the group over here in the panel has much experience of success. So when you have words like crowdsourcing, democracy, so what percentage of success have you had where the ideas go from, okay, everybody likes this idea, to it being successful and implemented? And the second is, how do you stop ideas being lost in translation?
Yeah, that's a really good one. Rashik, I'm going to ask you to take that first.
Okay, so the way we stop ideas from being lost in translation is the person who created the idea stays with the idea. So they file the idea, they champion it, and we put structure around them to give them the space to be able to take the idea forward. Because only they really truly understand the idea, and we augment that with other people to help them make that successful. And the journey for an idea from crowdsourced idea to reality, I would say it varies. Some of the crowdsourced ideas are probably not the best ideas we had, and some have been fantastic. So if you look at some of our open source work, which we did in the mid-90s, that's been incredibly successful. And it was driven because the crowd, the academy at the time, actually challenged management and said we had to do this. And by challenging and driving that need to open up in our technologies, we created markets that we didn't even think we could create at the time. So that's an example of where it's been very, very successful. If I look at some of the crowd ideas that we had over the last 3 years, I would say over half of them, if we would have gone forward with them, we would have found that we're not successful. Luckily, we trialed it. We got to a point where we felt this wasn't something that we could move forward with, and then they were stopped. So being able to fail fast is really important in this game as well.
And anything been lost in translation?
There's a very interesting challenge in translation, which is cultural. We are a truly global company. And you go to somewhere like Africa, which doesn't have the infrastructure, and you come with an idea which was created in the US, which has a very nice set of infrastructure. Those ideas do not translate. Right? They just do not work. And so you have to use local people who have local understanding to figure out what are the right solutions for those or products and services in those markets. And I think the translation issue is this globalization that creates tremendous tension, because the people who haven't traveled don't understand the reality of the community you're serving.
Well, this must be one for you, Luke, because obviously a company like Samsung, you're head of Europe here, cultural differences, things that don't translate.
So I'm actually with Tom on this one. So if you want something to not get lost in translation, build it, because then it's impossible. They see the thing that you envisaged. And I think the important point around democracy is ideas should be for everyone, not by everyone. And so our view of democratic innovation is a product that has a little bit in it for everyone, not necessarily something which has been sort of Frankenstein together from 1,000 different opinions. And so it's about sort of listening a lot, understanding what people want and building it, and making sure that lots of people can buy into that vision.
Professor Markides, I know that you want to weigh in on that one, but I also want to ask you to think about a question that's come through from the Twitter sphere here, if one can call it that. Can tomorrow's leaders use technology to lift economies out of poverty? And this also goes back to what Hussein Kanji was saying earlier on one of our earlier panels about how technology might exacerbate the inequality divide.
Definitely, and whoever asked that question should go out and buy my forthcoming book on exactly this issue, which is how the technologies of the social era are helping us actually create and spread social innovations in a decentralized way. So gone are the days when doctors will go to Africa to help poor, sick people, for example. We now have the technologies to empower local people to actually do the operations, you know, and with confidence that they're going to do the operations really well. Gone are the days when people will have to come to a centralized location like a university to get educated. We now have the technology to spread education in a very decentralized way all over Africa, all over the world. So I think the technologies will allow us in a very democratic way to reach out to poor parts of the world and help them solve some of the biggest social problems that we have faced. I'm very optimistic about this one.
Let me take one final question from the audience, then we're finished. Thank you very much to the gentleman in the front row.
Fleming Christensen, Sloan Fellow. I guess I'm curious, looking forward with innovation and the role of technology in innovation going forward, in terms of the process of innovation and the use of technologies to take that forward with Watson, artificial intelligence, and an application of big data to innovation. It's opening up at the moment through the social technology, and we're talking about openness and collaboration and engaging more people in organisations. But is this just a period when it's widening, or is it going to narrow again in the future with technology?
So let me take that. So when I look at where technologies like Watson are going, the ability to really mine and understand unstructured data in the form of documents and draw meaning out of that creates tremendous opportunities. So let me give you a cameo for that. I was actually in our Haifa lab a couple of weeks ago where we're building the next version of some of the Watson technology, and we're looking at Debater. And Debater allows us to ask a question and get a considered opinion on that question. And the question that we fed into the system was, what's your view on capital punishment? And it came back and it said, I've just looked at 2.5 million documents. These are the top 10 reasons why capital punishment are appropriate, and these are top 10 reasons why people are against capital punishment. There you go. Right. Now that as an example creates some really interesting questions in people's minds of what's the role of individuals and how does value get created. And for me, the future of technologies is not in being able to answer questions, but being able to form the right questions. So can artificial intelligence actually get to a point where it can discover new insights from data? We're a long way from that, and I wouldn't say we're anywhere near that. But I can see that in the next 20, 30, 40 years, we could get there. Right now, our challenge is how do we learn to ask the right questions? But by asking the right questions, we can use the plethora of information that sits out there in the form of the internet and corporate databases and so on, and be able to inform the opinions.
I guess the piece that I left off was, especially because we're very much uploading psychological profiles at the moment through social media. So the database that Watson's going to work off in 10 years is very different from the database it's working off right now.
Right, and actually psychological profiles is a really interesting topic because one of the pieces of technology we're playing with and actually got out there right now is we can take a small number of tweets, 20 to 30 tweets, and from that set of tweets you can build a very accurate psychometric profile. When I tried it across a team of 100, they took the 2-hour psychometric profile and we took 30 of their tweets. The comparison was between 85 and 90% correlated, so it was appropriate. Now, what that starts to do is allow you to think about the possibility of engaging in a personalized dialogue where you adapt the language that's used to meet that individual psychological profile, psychometric profile. So that kind of stuff is interesting, and it opens up many, many challenges around privacy and ethics and that kind of stuff, and the whole legal structure. So there's a tremendous amount of work to be done there, and we're right at the forefront of that, and that's where I see lots of innovation happening.
On that note, I'm afraid we've run out of time. I'd like to thank our guests and also to encourage you to continue this conversation online, on Twitter. You can find all of these 4 gentlemen on Twitter as well. Thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you very much.